India, a land that loves to turn it up to 11. Food, music, weddings. Have you ever seen Indian cinemas, particularly their action films? It makes me pine for the days of canon action films, just that fueled madness of the 80s. For 40 plus years, India's Arjun main battle tank has been called everything from an internationally confused fusion of disparate technology and doctrine to a boutique beast to a disaster that took decades. It can outshoot and outrun a T-90 in the desert allegedly, but it can't cross a bridge, run on paved roads, or ride standard rail wagons in the environment it was created to operate in, say others. So which of these is it? Is it a domestic failure, a qualified success? So today I'm going to park all the hot takes I can find, dig down the facts, trials, and infrastructure headache that made Arjun India's heaviest debate. Success or failure? Let's go. Hello and welcome back to another episode of A Tanker's View with me, your average internet dad bro with a penchant for starting international incidents. Me, Tony the Tanker. And boy howdy, am I probably going to step into it today. Well, we'll see anyway. So before I honk off a billion odd people, this video is not in any way meant with any malice. And if I do get some facets of your history wrong, I apologize in advance. I'm working with what I can find on a truncated schedule. And correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. I'm more than happy to just make amendments. And as always, thank you for watching. So why make this video anyway? Well, because in the world it is and current conflicts going along, countries are really looking to bring home domestic production because of the unreliability of certain arms markets. Now, yeah, some have been trying longer than others and are capable of at least some domestic capacity. Others on the map are content just to spend gobs and gobs of money with anyone willing to sell them the best and most amount of equipment possible. But this video isn't about Poland. Let's face it, out of the 5 biggest players on the field of weapons development and sales, US, France, Russia, China, and South Korea, half of whom you want to deal with are going to be adversaries. The other half probably aren't going to want to sell you their best stuff for obvious reasons, literally too many to name. So what is the largest non-aligned country in the world to do? Historically, well, that is very complicated. So I'm going to generalize the best I can here so the potatoes of this argument doesn't take up more space than the meat. That's why you're here, the tank. So before I get sidetracked, India was a founding member of the non-aligned states. It couldn't join NATO, couldn't join the Warsaw Pact, and given the state that India was in post the thorough colonial butt-fucking they got from the British Empire post-independence, they weren't exactly left with a whole lot of options of where to get their arms. A few cast-offs from your former empire is not exactly the best way to defend yourself from what is quickly becoming a whole lot of hostile nations around you. And a lot of your ground force fighting is going to be done in very disparate places, like I had mentioned. The Himalaya Plateau, the desert plains, subtropical jungles. You can't just have a one-size-all standardized force to try and fight in all these terrains. You're going to need to specialize. This doesn't lend itself to creating a standardized force. And given the modern army requires a strong armored fist, you can either A, build 2 tanks, one to operate in the high mountains, and then one to operate on the desert plains, or you can do what governments have done since time immemorial, make one unit try to do both and completely botch the job so hard that dummy YouTubers like me can pick on you for it. Nominally, India procured vast quantities of its initial military hardware from the USSR because intermittent arms embargoes from NATO. Because of course we can be just as big a dicks on the global stage as the USSR when it comes to certain things. As India cemented itself as an industrialized statist nation, it began to produce these weapons itself under license, and had more or less established its entire supply chain route along Soviet weight-classed vehicles. Now I want you to hold on to that thought for later because it becomes important. Now, as the Cold War ramped down, India had to make a serious effort at domestically designing and producing its own hardware, with varying levels of success, partnering with other nations to enhance other programs, but overall its primary arms partners were Russia post-Cold War because of pre-established supplies, sales, and industry. But the other players India brought weapons from were France for fighter jets, Israel for drones, Americas for logistics aircraft and gunships, and other nations around the world for niche systems relating to the Navy. But this video isn't about the build of the entire Indian military because I don't have all day or that much memory on my camera. So with that, let's look at what happens when a country tries to design and build its own domestic tank with access to all the generational knowledge and still winds up with what the world calls a lemon. Is it deserved? I don't know. That's what we're going to explore in this video. So please keep in mind that many of the sources I'm going to be referencing are Indian national sources, and while I've attempted to corroborate most of the claims, some of them you just have to take with a pinch of salt. Because national sources, again, are always just a little bit biased to themselves and try to oversell their successes, at least most cases. Chapter 1. What the Arjun was supposed to be. The Arjun is India's indigenous third-generation main battle tank, developed by the Defense Research Development Organization and built by the Heavy Vehicles Factory in Avdi. Now, I again apologize in advance if I mispronounce any of these Indian names. They don't roll well off my tongue, I'm sorry. These were meant to replace the fleets of T-72s and later T-90s. The early Mark I paired a 120mm rifle gun with Kanchan composite armor, advanced fire control systems, and a 1,400 horsepower MTU MB838 V10 diesel engine, the same one as the Leopard 1. Hang on to that thought for later. This also included the Rink epicyclic gearbox, a 4-person crew, and a Russian-style hydropneumatic suspension. Keep in mind that the Leopard 1 was over 20 tons lighter than the Arjun. Over time, it matured into the Mark 1A, a package with dozens of improvements. Better sights, hunter-killer capability, an indigenous 1,500 horsepower engine, beefed-up APU, safer ammo stowage, a mine plow, and some navigation upgrades and tweaked running gear. Chapter 2, The Case for Failure. So, odds are you've probably heard the Arjun called the failure. Much of that narrative comes from 3 places: time, weight, and scale. The first part being time. Development stretched across decades. Conception in the mid-1970s, initial service in the 2000s, iterative upgrades into the 2010s and 2020s. Coverage in the national interest hammers this point, branding the Arjun a program that took decades to build with a significant share of imported parts even after years of indigenization efforts. That's not unique among complex defense programs, but it became a bit of a cry for the critics. Now, comparatively, the Abrams tank took 8 years to go from development to deployment in units, and the Leopard 1 took just over a decade, started in the 50s and was mid-60s when it was deployed. Next section is weight. The Arjun sits in the heavy Western class of tanks, 60 to 68 tons depending on variant and kit. Great for protection, bad for India's infrastructure. Reports and commentary all over the 2010s noted bridge limitations, rail transport constraints, and a general strategic immobility. It's a pain in the ass to move them, apparently. Times of India reported from 2013 flagged Punjab's canal bridges are too fragile and weak for the tank without special arrangements. Analysis at The Wire argued that the Mark 1A would demand costly, widespread infrastructure reinforcement, constraining how and where the Army could deploy this tank. The print echoed this rail problem, noting the need for specialized bogie wheel wagon wells to move the tank. Wagons were not universally available. Even sympathetic voices acknowledged the Arjun's extra-wide tracks and width complicates standard Indian rail carriage. And that's a big thing because armies typically move their armored vehicles across, logistically, usually by train. North America does it, Europe does it, Asia does it, India does it. Why build the tank that you can't transport by rail? That's a huge problem. Next is scale, because despite decades of work, India has fielded only 2 regiments, 124 tanks, and ordered 118 Mark 1A tanks, well below their T-72 and T-90 fleet sizes. Critics again, including the national interest, have cast this as proof the Army never really planned to embrace Arjun for frontline mass deployment, preferring lighter, logistically simpler Russian designs for northern and canal-cut Western theaters. Not an unreasonable point to make. And again, there is the readiness and supply chain scars. In the mid-2010s, it's reported that nearly 3/4 of Arjuns were non-operational because they couldn't get spares for these tanks. That's a pretty embarrassing show for an indigenous piece that you're supposed to be proud of, like a national gem. To add it all up, the case for failures, well, it just sounds plain old straightforward. It was heavy, it's oversized, it can't be used in a lot of environments. It was late, 30 years in development for Pete's sake, 20 years of upgrades, and limited. There's only 2 regiments of these things and another 2 planned. Operationally, it was boxed into select desert sectors and logistically dependent on very specialized gear. It's just too scarce to matter in a subcontinent-wide international scale conflict. And that's really just the indictment of this whole tank. Chapter 3, the case for success. Now, before you all get mad at me, yes, I plan to bring up the successes of the Arjun tank. That is the point of this. So, on the other side of things, the Arjun's on-range performance and technology dividends are a lot tougher to dismiss. It shoots and moves quite well. In its 2010 Desert Comparative Trials, veteran defense journalist Ajay Shukla reported the Arjun outguns and outruns the T-90 with better accuracy, better mobility in the Thar Desert, and a higher crew comfort, which is pretty... Well, when it comes to T-Series tanks, higher crew comfort is a very, very low bar. The Army has since adopted DRDO's fire control innovations not only on the Arjun tank, but on Indian-built T-90s. A pretty solid nod to the fact that the tech is better than what it comes with. It's a technology ladder. The Mark 1A folds in 72 improvements, from a commander's panoramic sight with hunter-killer functionality, uncooled thermal imagers for the driver for night driving, safer ammo storage, improved suspension, final drives, mine plows, and a better APU for silent watch and running. The DRD's own materials and MOD releases emphasize greater indigenous content over the Mark 1, with the DRD's documents citing 54% indigenous content for the Mark 1A versus 41% for the Mark 1. It's not 100%, but it's upward movement, and that's actually what matters. Next up is it's a domestic production anchor. The 2021 order for 118 Mark 1A tanks isn't really symbolic, although it kind of is. It sustains heavy armored production capacity, suppliers, test QA pipelines, and support vehicles like these 70-ton transporters and ARVs, now being localized by BMEL and the DRDO. Even when these programs are imperfect, the manufacturing base is strategic. It lets India pivot to future designs and respond to embargo risks that could happen in the future. So for the success camp, if you judge the Arjun where it's meant to fight, the hot open desert, its firepower, FCS, and ride make it a serious machine and an unqualified success. It's seeded tech into India's wider armored fleet, raised indigenous content, and kept an industrial base alive. It's not the same as a mass all-terrain warhorse, but it's not nothing either. Chapter 4, the infrastructure trap. Here's where I hear all of those history nerds and engineering nerds just chittering away at the back of my head. Because here's the heart of the Arjun paradox. It's not just a tank problem, it's an infrastructure problem. Heavy tanks need heavy logistics. In India's case, that means broad gauge rail wagons with deep wells, high load ratings, and turning radii that suit the 60-plus ton loads, and bridges, lots of bridges for repeated armored traffic. Multiple sources highlight that the standard rail solutions and bridging problems in many northern sectors of India are a mismatch for the Arjun's width and mass. Punjab's canal grid is a classic example. Even if you deploy the Arjun into the region, crossing it repeatedly under wartime tempo is a different story. Specialized wagons exist, but if the mass availability lags, you bottleneck the strategic mobility of the tank. The exact this is the nightmare scenario that operational planners hate. You've got this fancy piece of kit, this awesome piece of kit. You can't take it or move it anywhere. It's too big for anywhere you need to fight. None of this makes the Arjun a bad tank per se, but it makes it a bad fit for some of India's most critical terrain. That nuance really does matter. If your decisive corridors are cut by canals or older bridges, a 45-50-ton tank you can move everywhere is going to beat a 68-ton tank you can move somewhere. And that argument shows up repeatedly in the Indian commentary, now by retired armored officers and defense reporters. Chapter 5. Why the Army didn't buy thousands. India fields large fleets of T-72 and T-90 tanks, lighter, narrower, and thoroughly integrated into its existing rail, road, and bridge solutions. When the Ladakh crisis demanded rapid armor flows at high altitude, India could move T-Series tanks by air and road far easier than any heavy Western-style MBT. This is why India's planners pushed concurrently for a light tank in mountain warfare roles as the Arjun Mark 1A order went through. The opportunity of cost of re-engineering your entire national infrastructure around a single heavy type tank, well, it just really didn't sell. And scales matter for sustainment. A smaller fleet means fewer economies of scale in spares, training, simulators, recovery and bridge assets. The mid-2010s spares drought alone, with 75% of the fleet grounded, left a massive scar on the program's credibility right there when it needed confidence. Even with recovery and upgrades, the Army's revealed preference versus what it actually buys in bulk, it has kind of stayed with the lighter type tanks, where it can use them more, where the fight is more ongoing. Chapter 6, what that trial really said. Now, remember that quote I said earlier about it outgunning and outshooting the T-90? Well, it's a pretty easy quote to cherry pick, because the Arjun versus T-90 desert trials generated a lot of strong headlines in that era, claiming the Arjun outshot and outmaneuvered the T-90 in Rajasthan. And they matter because it demonstrates the tactical performance of the Arjun's best environment, hot, open, and relatively flat. But it doesn't erase the other strategic mobility constraints elsewhere. It doesn't solve the scale and logistics calculus. And in other words, it proved the Arjun can fight, but its procurement history shows that the Army doubts it can fight everywhere they need it to. Both can't be true. So which one is it going to be? Chapter 7. Does the Mark 1A, does that change the verdict on the Arjun? Now, the Mark 1A is the program's best argument for a qualified success. With its 72 improvements from auto tracker to crew survivability, navigation and silent watch, the tank is better at the things the Arjun already did well. DRDO claims higher indigenous content than the Mark 1, a tangible step forward towards self-reliance, yes. The sticking points, though, mass and width, remain. And the engine supply hiccups suggest the supply train is still maturing. But if the question is, did India build a modern main battle tank that works in the desert and advances local industry, then the Mark 1A lets you answer that yes, with fewer caveats than before. So, in a way, it does change the verdict in some senses. Chapter 8, Armored Warfare and the Popular Press View of the Arjun. Gaming and enthusiast venues sometimes go hard on the failure label. Armored Warfare's Armored Failures column lists the familiar knocks: excessive weight, engine overheating in early years because of the small size of the engine put in it, meant for a 40-ton tank is not a 68-ton tank. But their own roundups cold list Arjun's improvements, from the Kachan Plus armor, better FCS, safer ammo racks, because the platform did evolve, it did get better. The popular press verdicts usually hinge on the fit to India's terrain and logistics rather than the claim that the Arjun can't fight. And that's a pretty subtle distinction. You know, yeah, it can fight, just not everywhere they want it to. What's the old saying? Task failed successfully? Chapter 9. Failure versus success. Defining the terms. If you define domestic success as did it deliver indigenous tech, raise local content, create an industrial base, deliver a field-capable desert main battle tank in meaningful, if limited numbers, then yes, the Arjun is an unqualified success. In terms of service, it performs its intended environment, and it seeded technology into related Indian platforms. It also secured a fresh 118 heavy tank order and spawned a web of support vehicles and transport solutions now being localized. However, if you define failures as did it arrive late, cost a lot, stay logistics fragile, and fail to achieve fleet mass or universal deployability across India's key theaters, then yeah, Arjun is a failure in the broad force planning sense of the word. The Army's buying behavior, sticking with the lighter T-Series tanks in huge quantities, plus pushing hard for light tanks in the mountains, speaks louder than any brochure. Both verdicts can coexist because they answer very different parts of the question. The Arjun is a good tank, just in the wrong country's infrastructure. Or more charitably, it should be said that India shouldn't have built a heavy Western-style MBT in a subcontinent rail structure bridge reality that reflected Soviet-style weight classes. I think that's the best way I could put it. Chapter 10. What does this mean for India's next tank? The smart takeaway isn't never build heavy tanks. It's to design your roads and rails and upgrade them accordingly. If India wanted thousands of heavy main battle tanks, the infrastructure's got to match. If it wants a rapid theater-wide flexibility, lighter designs in the 45-50 ton bracket, or an all-new modular platform family, that makes a whole lot more sense with their infrastructure. The push for light tanks and mountain rolls underscores this. While the Mark 1A does keep the heavy armor industry rolling long enough to pivot, that's actually, it works out to be good equilibrium in a country with such varied terrains and threat axes. Have a heavy tank for the desert, build a light tank for the mountains. That's what India should have done from the get-go. Chapter 11, my verdict. So, is the Arjun a domestic failure or success? Both. It's a nationwide industrial project. It was a qualified success. They built a fully capable heavy main battle tank that could operate in the desert and beat the crap out of what it was supposed to beat the crap out of. That is a success. As India's universal frontline tank, no, it did not. Its width and height are too big, too heavy for any of its major infrastructure in the north. It can't operate in the mountains. And that's a fatal flaw for a country that does half of its fighting in the mountains. If you want a neat label, call Arjun India's best desert main battle tank that never became its main battle tank. The real challenge now isn't defending its past choices, it's building up the next tank and the infrastructure it's going to rely on, and preparing for the next threats ahead, because tanks are evolving right now at a breakneck pace because of the way nature and war is evolving at a breakneck pace. Cope cages are becoming a thing even on Western vehicles. So, we'll see what the future holds. And with that all being out of the way, again, all of my sources are going to be linked in a document down below. And thank you again all for watching. Thank you for my lovely patrons for making this content possible. You are all lovely legends. I will see you guys next time. Peace.